Welcome to Whispered Tales. Today we will bring you a powerful, soul-touching journey titled Become the Best Version of Yourself. Ethan Miller never thought life could feel this heavy. At 29, he sat alone in his tiny New Jersey apartment, the light from the street lamp flickering through his window like it was mocking him. Piles of unopened mail lay across his kitchen table, past due notices, rent reminders, and a letter from his boss that simply said, "Meeting required, performance decline." His life wasn't supposed to look like this. Not after all the dreams he once had.
He used to imagine becoming someone confident, someone respected, someone with purpose. But somewhere along the way, everything slipped through his fingers. His friends moved on, his relationship ended, and his confidence disappeared in the quietest, most painful way. That night, Ethan stared at his own reflection in the black screen of his TV. He barely recognized the man looking back. Tired eyes, unshaven face, shoulders weighed down by a decade of silent disappointment. He whispered to himself, "How did I become this version of me?" And that question hit him harder than anything else. Because deep down he knew he had stopped trying. He had simply let life happen to him, moment by moment, day by day. But something strange stirred inside him that night, a quiet, persistent ache. Not sadness, not fear, something different. A tiny spark, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was the turning point. Ethan didn't know it yet, but his journey to becoming the best version of himself had already begun. Not with a victory, not with clarity, but with the simple, painful realization that he wanted more than the life he was living. He breathed deeply, wiped his eyes, and whispered into the silence, "I want to change. I just don't know how." He didn't know that everything would soon shift, that one decision, one moment, one unexpected encounter would push him toward a future he never thought he deserved. But that's how all transformations begin, with a whisper inside the heart that says, "This is not who I'm meant to be." And for the first time in years, Ethan listened. The next morning, Ethan woke up with the same heaviness he'd carried for months, but something felt different. Not better, not brighter, just different. Like a quiet shift had taken place inside him, the way the ocean changes tides without anyone noticing. He stepped outside and walked aimlessly through the chilly New Jersey morning. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold wind. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay in that suffocating apartment. By late afternoon, he found himself on an old pedestrian bridge overlooking the Passaic River. The water below looked calm, moving slowly, reflecting the pale winter sky. Ethan leaned against the railing, staring at the ripples, wondering how long it had been since he felt truly alive. That's when he heard a voice behind him. "You look like someone with a storm in your mind." Ethan turned. An older man stood a few feet away. Gray beard, worn jacket, eyes sharp but kind. He held a cup of coffee and offered a small nod as if they were old acquaintances.
"I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "Didn't mean to look that obvious." The man chuckled. "Son, storms are easy to see. It's the sunshine. People hide better." Ethan had no idea why, but he didn't walk away. Maybe he needed someone, anyone, to talk to. Maybe he felt safe with a stranger who knew nothing about him. They stood side by side in silence for a few seconds. "What's your name?" the man eventually asked. "Ethan." "I'm Samuel," the man replied gently. "And I've been where you are." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You don't even know where I am." Samuel smiled softly. "I don't need to. Pain is universal. But so is hope." Ethan swallowed, his chest tightening. "How did you become the best version of myself?" Samuel finished for him. Ethan stared at him, stunned. "It's written all over your face," Samuel continued. "You're not lost, Ethan. You're just tired of the version of you that you've been tolerating." Ethan looked away. His throat felt tight. "I feel like I've wasted years," he whispered. Samuel took a slow sip of coffee. "Then make the rest of your years something you can be proud of." The simplicity of that sentence hit Ethan like a punch to the heart. Samuel placed a hand on the railing and looked out at the river. Life doesn't change in one big moment. It changes in 100 small decisions. One step, then one more. You don't have to know who you'll become. Just decide who you don't want to be anymore. Ethan felt a warmth in his chest. The first flicker of hope he'd felt in months. Samuel gently tapped Ethan's shoulder. "Come back to this bridge in a week. Tell me one thing you changed. Just one. I'll be here." And just like that, the stranger walked away. Ethan stood frozen, watching him disappear into the quiet street. He had no idea why that conversation felt so important, but something deep inside told him this was the first step. The first step toward becoming something more than the version of himself he had settled for. The journey had begun, quietly, unexpectedly, on a cold bridge, by a calm river. But sometimes, that's exactly where new lives start. For the first time in months, Ethan walked home with something unfamiliar beating inside him. A sense of direction. Not clarity, not confidence, but a direction. A path that felt almost invisible, yet strangely real. One small change. That was all Samuel had asked for. But what could he change? His life felt like a cluttered room with no space to move. He needed something simple, something he couldn't talk himself out of. That night, at exactly 11:13 p.m., Ethan made a decision. He grabbed a trash bag.
not for actual trash, but for everything in his apartment that reminded him of who he didn't want to be anymore. Empty boxes, old clothes that carried memories of failure, notebooks filled with unfinished goals, photos that only made him feel smaller, anything that whispered the wrong story about his life. Item by item, he tossed them into the bag. At first, it felt like nothing. Then, it felt like everything.
The more he cleared, the lighter he felt, not physically, but emotionally. It was as if he was cleaning his mind by cleaning his space, making room for a version of himself he hadn't met yet. When he finished, the apartment looked almost foreign, quiet, simple, uncluttered. And for the first time since moving in, Ethan could breathe. He stood in the center of his living room and whispered, "This is a start. Just a start." The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual, not because he felt energized, but because he felt responsible. He had made a promise to a stranger and to himself. He showered, shaved, dressed in clean clothes, and made coffee. Not the usual rushed, bitter mess, but a slow, calm cup he actually tasted. He sat by the window and let the sunlight warm his face. A thought crossed his mind. Is this what discipline feels like? Not loud, not dramatic, just intentional. He arrived at work on time, something he hadn't done in weeks. His boss, Mr. Donovan, raised an eyebrow as Ethan walked in. "Everything okay?" It wasn't mocking, it was genuine. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I'm working on it." And for a moment, Ethan saw something in his boss's eyes. Belief. Maybe small, but real. The entire day, Ethan did something unusual. He paid attention. He listened during meetings. He responded quickly. He didn't hide or avoid tasks. And when he didn't understand something, he asked instead of pretending.
No miracles happened that day, but something far more powerful did. He kept the promise of a single small change. When night fell and Ethan lay in bed, he thought about Samuel's words, one step, then one more. He closed his eyes with a quiet determination he had never felt before. Next week, he would stand on that bridge again, and he would not go empty-handed. His journey to becoming the best version of himself had officially, undeniably begun, with a trash bag, a clean room, and one honest day of effort.
It wasn't much, but it was everything. A week later, Ethan returned to the bridge, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The winter wind nipped at his face, and the river shimmered under the pale sunlight the same way it had the week before. But this time, he wasn't the same man. Samuel was there, leaning casually against the railing, holding the same worn coffee cup, as if he had been expecting Ethan all along.
Samuel was there, leaning casually against the railing, holding the same worn coffee cup, as if he had been expecting Ethan all along. "So," Samuel said, his voice calm, "what did you change?" Ethan hesitated.
He wanted to say something grand. I got a promotion. I exercised every day. I read a book. But he realized the truth was simpler.
I cleaned my apartment, Ethan admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. And I tried to pay attention, really pay attention at work. Samuel's eyes twinkled. Good. That's enough. Ethan blinked. Enough? That's it? Just that? Samuel chuckled. Do you see how easy it is to underestimate small victories? They are the foundation. The first stone of a mountain is tiny, but it carries the weight of all stones above it.
Ethan nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Samuel gestured to the railing. Look into the water, Samuel said. Ethan peered down, seeing his reflection rippled by the cold wind. The face staring back at him seemed different, not because it had changed, but because he had started to notice himself. He had begun to see the truth, the parts of him he had ignored, the strength he had forgotten he possessed.
You see, Samuel continued, becoming your best self isn't about immediate transformation. It's about noticing who you really are, accepting it, and making one small change that honors that truth. Ethan thought about the week, how he had felt more present, more alive, even if it was just slightly. He realized he had begun to reclaim himself from the shadows of his own mind. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder. The mirror doesn't lie, Ethan, but most people are too afraid to look. You looked. That makes you different already.
For the first time, Ethan felt proud of something he had done for himself. Not someone else, not to prove anything, but just for him. A flicker of self-respect, delicate but unmistakable, had taken root. Samuel smiled. Next step is simple. Choose one more change. Something that challenges you, that scares you even. You're ready. Ethan exhaled slowly. Fear and excitement tangled inside him, but he felt a strange clarity. The journey ahead was long, and he would stumble, fail, and doubt himself. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it.
He walked back home, carrying the quiet weight of responsibility and possibility. And in his chest, the spark that had begun on that night, alone in his apartment, burned a little brighter. Becoming the best version of yourself wasn't a single moment of glory. It was a lifetime of choices, reflections, and courage to face yourself in the mirror. And Ethan had just taken his second step. The days that followed were quiet, but transformative. Ethan began to notice a rhythm emerging in his life, a routine that felt intentional, even if it was small. He realized that becoming the best version of himself wasn't about massive leaps, it was about consistency. He started waking up earlier than he ever had, before the noise of the world reached his apartment. The mornings became sacred. A cup of coffee, a short walk, a few minutes of journaling. He didn't fill the pages with grand ideas or resolutions. Instead, he wrote honestly about what he felt, what he feared, and what he hoped to become. Each word was like a tiny seed planted in the fertile soil of his mind.
At work, he kept a simple practice. Each morning, he listed 3 things he wanted to achieve. Not for anyone else, not to impress his boss, but for himself. Small tasks: responding to emails on time, finishing a report, helping a colleague. But each small success began to build momentum. Slowly, quietly, Ethan felt his confidence returning.
Evenings were dedicated to reflection. He would sit by his window, watch the city lights flicker across New Jersey streets, and think about the choices he had made that day. What went right? What went wrong? What could he do better tomorrow? It wasn't perfection he sought, just progress.
And then something unexpected happened. He began noticing the people around him. The receptionist, who always smiled but rarely received acknowledgement. The coworker, struggling with a deadline. The neighbor, juggling kids and work. Ethan started offering small gestures of kindness. A smile, a few encouraging words, a helping hand. At first, it felt awkward, but soon he realized how much joy it brought him. Not recognition, not reward, just the quiet satisfaction of making someone else's day a little better. Samuel's words echoed in his mind. Life changes in 100 small decisions.
Ethan began to understand that routine wasn't mundane, it was powerful. It was the scaffolding that supported transformation. Each small habit, each intentional choice was constructing the person he wanted to become. One night, after a particularly long day at work, he sat in his apartment and looked around. The room was still clean, still organized, but now it felt like a reflection of him. Someone who cared enough to take control of their life. Someone who was trying. Someone who refused to give up. He smiled quietly. He was only a few weeks into this journey, but for the first time in a long time, he believed in the man he was becoming. Because becoming the best version of yourself, Ethan realized, wasn't about dramatic breakthroughs. It was about the discipline to show up day after day for yourself. And with that, he felt ready to take the next step, something bigger, something that would truly test his courage. Ethan's newfound routine brought stability, but it also revealed a hidden truth. Change is uncomfortable. The more he grew, the more he noticed the parts of himself he had been avoiding, fears he had tucked away in corners of his mind, pretending they didn't exist. One evening, while sitting in his apartment with a journal on his lap, he realized the next step in his journey would demand courage. Not the kind of courage that comes from applause or recognition, but the raw, quiet courage to confront the life he had been running from. The fear had many faces: fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear that he might never truly escape the weight of his past. Ethan had felt these fears his whole life, but now, armed with a sense of purpose, They loomed larger because he had started to care about what his life could become. He thought about a conversation he had overheard at work a few weeks ago. A colleague talking about a business pitch she had been terrified to deliver. But she had faced it, stumbled, and succeeded anyway. The image stuck with him, not because of her success, but because of her willingness to act despite fear. That night, Ethan made a decision. He would confront one fear he had avoided for years: public speaking. It wasn't a grand speech or a career-changing presentation, just a small community seminar about a topic he loved: photography. He had always been passionate about capturing moments, but he had never shared that passion publicly. The thought of standing in front of strangers made his heart pound. Sweat formed on his palms. Thoughts raced. What if they laugh? What if I freeze? What if I fail? And yet, beneath all that fear, another feeling simmered: determination. He realized that growth was inseparable from discomfort. If he wanted to become the best version of himself, he couldn't avoid fear. He had to face it, embrace it, and let it shape him. Ethan spent the next week preparing meticulously. He practiced in front of the mirror, recorded himself, and even rehearsed in empty rooms late at night. Each time fear crept in, he acknowledged it and continued anyway. Slowly, he began to notice a shift. Fear no longer paralyzed him. It energized him, sharpened his focus, and reminded him that he was alive. Finally, the night of the seminar arrived. Ethan stood backstage, listening to the murmur of the audience, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. But he remembered Samuel's words: one step, then one more. He stepped onto the stage, hands slightly trembling, heart pounding, and faced the audience. And as he spoke, stumbling at first, then finding his rhythm, he realized something profound. Courage doesn't come from the absence of fear. It comes from moving forward despite it. By the end of the seminar, Ethan felt transformed. Not because he had delivered the perfect speech, but because he had confronted a fear that had held him captive for years. He had faced the truth about himself and survived. And in that moment, he understood that fear wasn't the enemy. It was a guide, pointing him toward the areas in his life where growth waited. After the seminar, Ethan felt a sense of exhilaration he hadn't experienced in years. But the high didn't last long. Life, he realized, wasn't just about conquering personal fears. It was also about the people we let into our lives and the influence they wield over our growth. He began to notice the subtle ways his environment had shaped him, both positively and negatively. Some colleagues at work were supportive, encouraging even, while others thrived on gossip, negativity, and self-doubt. His social circle, once filled with friends who tolerated his insecurities, had slowly grown smaller, and he now saw clearly why. They didn't inspire him to grow. Ethan realized that becoming the best version of himself required more than discipline, courage, and routine.
It required cultivating a circle of influence that nurtured his potential. He started reaching out to people who inspired him, mentors, old friends with shared ambitions, and even strangers he admired on social platforms who shared insights about creativity, productivity, and personal development.